Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the 16th session of our VR and XR Training and Education, Knowledge and Experience Sharing Speaker Series, which is being presented in collaboration with the DexR Lab at York University. I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I would strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speakers, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ahmed Mohammadi. Dr. Ahmed Mohammadi is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Civil Engineering at York University in Toronto, Ontario, where he received his PhD in transportation engineering. His research focuses on applications of virtual reality in transportation safety, traffic conflict analysis, and traffic microsimulation modeling. His research contributes to improving transportation safety and efficiency. Ahmed is also the coordinator of Disaster and Emergency Extended Virtual Reality Lab, or the DexR Lab at York University. Dr. Mohammadi, thank you so much for moderating today's session and your ongoing support for this series. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Francesco. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another VR session. Today we have three speakers. I would like to introduce the first speaker, who is Jamie. Jamie Oresar is the General Education Curriculum Coordinator and a Professor of Sociology and Equity Studies in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Niagara College, teaching courses centered on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility over the past 13 years. Jamie is deeply committed to social justice, rooting her approach to teaching and learning in anti-oppressive, intersectional, and decolonial lenses. With over 20 years of teaching and working across the globe, she has been able to learn alongside students and faculties across the world, including Canada, Australia, China, Mexico, Jamaica, and Kenya. The second speaker is Jim McEwan, who developed the adaptive technology specialist position at Niagara College. He has been working one-on-one with the students for over 20 years. He is a patient about technology for student success. His motto is the right technology used well can change everything. He believes XR in education, like adaptive technology, has the potential to level the playing field by providing struggling students with engaging, explicit, and repeatable experiences to deepen understanding. The last speaker is Dr. Maureen Connolly, who is a professor of physical education and kinesiology in the Faculty of Applied Health Science, Brock University. Maureen's academic interests include curriculum, stress embodiment, dance and movement education, and Freirean approach to teaching and learning. Her theoretical dispositions are semiotic, phenomenological, post-anti-colonial, anti-ableist, and irreverent, and quixotic. Thank you very much. So without further delay, I'm gonna pass the panels to the speakers.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen.
Well, welcome everybody. We've divided the slides among us because we are a collaborative group. And we are very aware of how much of our labor is shared and intersecting and overlapping. So my pleasure to welcome you and introduce you to our project. It's an idea, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, where we're learning to foster authentic inclusion for accessibility through VR simulations. But we like to think about our VR simulations as simulations with a bit of an edge. So let's show the next slide. Yeah, so here's how our session is going to unfold today. We'll do this welcome, and we've done the introductions. Jim and Jamie are going to talk you through the project and the outcomes. We'll do an overview of the scenarios because we went with scenarios rather than simulations, which is a shift that is important in inclusion work, behind the scenes stuff, supporting resources so you know what we used and sort of how we used it, and then the stuff that we're doing to encourage users to interact with our materials in ways that continue to be meaningful. And I will now pass slide number 3 over to Jim.
Hi, so about our project is that we had our funding through eCampus Ontario, and we worked with Niagara College, Brock University, and the developer was Expert VR. And so some of you may have seen them in a previous session. I think Evan was interviewed. So I do want to acknowledge Evan and Drew from Expert VR. There's a fourth person who is significantly involved, Teresa and Zinvino. And we also had a master's student, Chi Wan, who was a big part of it, as well as CAPA, the Center for Accessibility Physical Activity Advisory Council. And so we'll talk more about them shortly. I'm Jim McEwan. We already did instructions, so for the sake of time, we'll go through these. Is that okay? And Dr. Maureen Connolly from Brock University and Jamie Oresar from Niagara College.
Thanks, Jim. So for our project outcomes, we have 5. The first is we wanted to create a space where users could learn to identify instances of ableism and disableism in various environments, both living, learning, and working environments. So we focused all of our scenarios in a post-secondary educational environment across various departments, security, parking, a faculty office, as well as a cafe on campus. But you will see, and we'll speak a little bit to it a little bit later, but you'll see that the scenarios can be applied to really any context, whether it be various workplaces or service-based agencies or social and even interpersonal contexts. Outcome number 2 was looking at assessing learners or users' understanding of accessibility and authentic inclusion, particularly around visible and invisible disabilities, principles of universal design for learning, accessible education standards, and AODA requirements, the requirements here in Ontario for accessibility. So we wanted to use all scenarios that were based on the lived experiences of people from disability communities. We actually shaped each of the scenarios around the stories that were shared with us and the lived experience that was shared through ongoing consultation with the CAPA Advisory Council that Jim had mentioned a little bit earlier, so that each situation were actual encounters that happened in real life. And then Jim, I'll just ask you to flip the slide to the last few outcomes there. Outcome 3 was not only having users understand barriers to accessibility or raise awareness around those barriers to accessibility, but also give them a safe place to be able to practice anti-ableism strategies, right? In a space where they can't do further harm, A, and B, a place where they might feel a little bit more comfortable to be able to engage with some of the internal biases that might manifest as you know, prejudice or discrimination towards people with disabilities, or possibly furthering and maintaining barriers that already exist, particularly in our institutions. Outcome 4 is very simple. We wanted students to learn in a different way. And we know that VR has a way of engaging students in both cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. And I think the affective domain is particularly important when we're trying to understand the experiences of equity deserving groups like people with disabilities. It also, we also know that VR increases emotional engagement with the content. So that really helps to foster empathy in ways that just listening to somebody's story may not do. And then lastly, outcome 5 is attempting to evaluate student learning by asking them to assess their perceptions of change in their knowledge or skills, their attitudes, and future behaviors, which we measure with a student assessment tool that we'll highlight in a few slides.
So when we created our simulation, we did it on a variety of devices. So we have the VR version, which is done on a Quest. It runs on a Quest 2 and a Quest 3 and a Quest Pro. And the reason why you might want to use that is for the immersion. Also, it gives you a level of privacy. We encourage students to avoid sociability bias. And so with that, you have the privacy to make those decisions that you want to see play out. The PC version is a flat version, so it can be used anywhere, as well as the Scorum, which is built into our LMS called D2L, but it can be used in many LMSs. And so the flat versions are for people who might have difficulty with the virtual reality for various reasons. Whether nausea, size of glasses, etc. And so now we're going to take a look at the 4 scenarios that we created. And from the VR perspective, we have created these with increasingly interactivity. So the first few, you just click on the responses to bring the scenario forward. And then the last 2 end up having a little more information presented in a virtual way. You can even on the last 2 select barriers to accessibility in the physical space. So that's kind of a neat thing.
Yeah, so scenario 1, and I just want to say before we kind of get into the scenarios, when we first began this project and had our early conversations, especially with our expert VR team, we needed to sort of reestablish the whole idea of the difference between a scenario and a simulation, because maybe 20 years ago, working to improve inclusion-based thinking, a lot of people were doing simulations where non-disabled people were sitting in wheelchairs or wearing glasses that took away their vision, or simulating different types of bodily experience with the presumed good intention of bringing the non-disabled person into what it's like to be a disabled person in a particular culture. But very quickly, we realized, especially given the work of disabled scholars, that this type of experience with disability diminishes the complexity of disabled life. And and it also increases the likelihood that non-disabled people will continue to see disabled life as tragic. And so we felt very much the commitment to move away from a simulation mentality and to honor the principles of disability justice and work with scenarios, as Jamie and Jim have both mentioned already, that bring you inside an interactive experience with a disabled person where that person is narrating from a site of expertise. They're experts on the life that they're living. And interacting in that way makes this more of a scenario approach than a simulation approach. So we were lucky that we worked with more than luck. We had committed people with Expert VR who really made that shift quickly and said, okay, we got it. And then they moved away from that simulation mindset into a scenario mindset and really helped us kind of keep that commitment to our disability justice principles. So scenario one is a concussion scenario. And we chose a concussion scenario because many students and many individuals in workplaces are experiencing concussion. In my situation as a university professor, a lot of the stereotypes around concussion is that it's varsity athletes who are experiencing concussions. However, it's simply not the case. The majority of students in my classes who experience concussion are not varsity athletes. They're students who go away on skiing weekends, or there's someone who's lost their balance and smashed their head against a wall while regaining their balance, or it's someone who happened to play bubble soccer on the weekend and fell over unexpectedly. It's seldom the varsity athletes. They're in the minority, actually, of concussions. So we wanted to bring forward like the everyday likelihood of concussion and have a conversation between two people, one of whom had a previous discussion, and the other interlocutor who's someone who's in the midst of experiencing a discussion. And that is the conversation that unfolds, and the conversation allows the newly concussed person to engage with someone who's on the other side of a concussion and get a better sense of an anticipatory set for what's coming, and also to debunk some of the myths around concussion and to provide some strategies. So that's scenario one. And then scenario two is an accommodation meeting with a new student. And the interlocutor here, the person coming into the scenario, is a professor. So if you entered this scenario and interacted with our student, Alex, you would be interacting as a professor. And that is the scenario you'd be entering. And Alex is presenting the professor with a letter of accommodation. In that letter, Alex's accommodations are detailed, and then Alex is doing self-advocacy to negotiate how things in the semester could unfold to make it possible for them to have more successful learning. And the professor in this scenario has options of going with the accommodations or offering resistance or protest to the accommodation, and then different options unfold from there. We're going to talk a little bit later about what happens backstage, putting these scenarios together. But the choices that the professor character makes will open up different options in the interaction. And this is a scenario that really places the student discussing the scenario in more of the power chair, as it were. The student is the one who is assuming that this is a perfectly legitimate experience and normalizes the whole notion of accommodation for successful learning. And then the professor's responsibility in here is interacting and getting to know the student. But then, of course, there's lots of options that can unfold depending on how the professor character responds. Over to Jamie for scenario 3 and 4.
Thanks, Maureen. So in scenario 3, the user takes on the role of somebody who works in the parking office, and you are interacting or hopefully supporting Layla, who is a student with low vision and who uses a mobility aid or a walker or uses a walker for mobility. But in the scenario itself, Layla has an issue with accessible parking. And she's come to the office to talk about that issue. And as Jim had mentioned, unlike scenario 1 and 2, scenario 3 also has the ability for you to engage with Layla in that interaction, learn from Layla as the expert on her own experience, hopefully support Layla in her issue or with highlighting the barrier to accessibility in the instance. But when that conversation is over, the user can then take a look around that parking office and try to identify some of the physical barriers that might be in place in that office. Things like the height of the desk, the map for the campus, the size of the map, the partition, the glass partition that is between you as the user and Layla as she comes into the office, highlighting some of those, moving around the room and being able to highlight some of those physical barriers as well. One thing we haven't mentioned yet that I think is important to recognize is, and I guess we'll talk about it when we get to the assessment tool piece, but we organize the scenarios so that they're not just hyper-focused on physical spaces. And we know physical barriers are hugely important when it comes to accessibility, but we also focused a lot on the attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities encounter in these various scenarios, in these various contexts. So attitudinal barriers, in addition to barriers around information and communication, are all integrated into the scenario. Barriers to technology, as well as some of the systemic barriers that are in place in the policies and the procedures that are institutionalized, particularly in educational institutions. So you get the chance in scenario 3 and also in 4 to work around the room and select some of those barriers to communication or barriers to accessibility. And then in scenario 4, I'll ask Jim to change the slide there. You are a security guard on campus and you've asked Malik to come in to your office because there has been an official complaint filed against him. And in this scenario, it's saturated with assumptions that are made around wheelchair usage. And Malik is a student on campus who utilizes a wheelchair. And in this situation, there's been a complaint filed against him, accusing him of a sexual assault, essentially. And it's because there's the misconception that his fiance was his personal support worker in this scenario. So bringing up a lot of misconceptions, assumptions that are made, and deconstructing those. So again, in scenario 4, you have the opportunity to look around the room and identify some of those physical or even attitudinal barriers that are manifested in, say, the poster on the wall and in those other, in the space itself. So I think in the next slide, we're going to take a sneak peek into some of the scenarios and be able to see the environments that are here. We won't play the whole thing because it is 3 minutes long, but we'll play enough of it, about 20 seconds, for you to get an idea of what the physical environments, or the, I guess, virtual environments look like for each of the scenarios.
There we go. So that was just a taste of what the environments look like. And in these scenarios, as we already said, they are not based on simulations specifically as trying on a disability. Rather you are the individual who is technically the person in authority, and we give you the option to go down paths that may in real life would harm a person, but in virtual reality we can do those safely without harming someone. And so the person with the disability is placed as the expert on their own disability. And as you talk to them, you get to see the fallout of ableism, for example, in these scenarios. As Jamie said, the idea of physical barriers are often plain to see by anyone who kind of understands that. But what we don't normally get to see is what happens when a person with a disability encounters ableism. And so there's, you have the ability and the opportunity to interact with people in workspaces that are educational, service, and other contexts. In the scenarios, we use first-person language and identity. We recognize that not everybody identifies with this, and some people prefer a disability-first language rather than a person-first language, and that is fully acceptable, but we had to choose something, and we chose disability or person-first language. We also looked at the idea of adding simulation choices. So what happens in the simulations is that you encounter a person with a disability, they say something to you, and then you have predefined options to choose. And we have given you some predefined options that are ableist. And so when we work with students or anybody with these simulations, we encourage them to go down those paths that they otherwise might not, and see where it leads. So we encourage people to be aware of social desirability. And being that it's a simulation about accessibility, we felt very strongly that we needed to have accessible features. And as you may or may not know, accessibility in VR isn't the most common thing to encounter. So we ended up pointing our developers, Expert VR, to a toolkit called Seeing VR. And it's a Unity plugin made by Microsoft that adds these options. So it's pretty neat. For example, text to speech is on by default. So in the simulation, the non-playable character will say something to you, and then when you mouse or put your indicator over top of the dialogue that you would be saying, normally reading, you'll hear it out loud, so that it's right off the bat a little more accessible for people with reading disabilities, for example. It includes things like object description, so you turn that on and you mouse, we'll just use the term mouse, you mouse over an object and it'll say a chair. We tried to make it as close as we could to being accessible to everyone. VR, unfortunately, isn't terribly accessible to those who are blind, although there's a lot of work going on with that right now. We actually recently showed this at the XR Access Symposium, and there's a lot of people who are really looking forward to working on accessibility features in virtual reality. When we were there, we actually had the opportunity to have a person who was deaf use the simulation, and we learned some interesting and helpful insights, as well as a person who's blind. Some really great suggestions by that person. If we go on to further work on this tool or this simulation, then we may look into implementing those as well. So now we're going to take a look at the design side of the process. We did not program the software. XR Expert VR did the programming, but we did the designing and we were able to interact with them each step of the way. So we'll go into that, and go ahead, Maureen.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I'm kind of bringing you behind the curtain and so that you can see that the front stage looks great and the programmers do great work, but the programmers need ingredients. They need content in order to build the front stage experience. And so the strategies that we use backstage are scenarios. So we come up with a scenario, and actually we were really blessed in terms of our ability to interact with disabled people in the community. So the scenarios that we designed them because people told us that they actually happened. So we didn't have to create fiction. We actually, created scenarios based on things that disabled people have experienced with concussion, with professors, with parking services, with security personnel, with complaints and so on. So the stories are true to life, but obviously behind the scenes we had to do these branched narratives, and you can see how you lay out. This is the big look without getting like into the weeds of what happens in each place, but you can see there's different color coding. And when you introduce, say, the start of the scenario, this happens, this happens. If this happens, the scenario will go here. If that happens, it will go there. And so we have to anticipate and design the interactions based on where a conversation could go. So in the scenario with Malik, for example, who's coming in to talk to the security fellow about his supposed assault of his personal support worker, the security person, there's an aspect in there where Malik gets out, stands and transfers into a regular seat out of his wheelchair. And the security guard is surprised. Whoa, I didn't think people who use wheelchairs could stand up. So that's one way it goes, right? And then, but if the person, if another scenario was, oh, I'm really sorry that the chairs are bolted to the floor, that's really inaccessible, then the conversation would go in a different direction. So when we're designing backstage, we're looking at different possible conversations. And then we make these trees, these little conversation trees and drop downs backstage in these frames. So do you want to show the next slide so we can show? Yeah. So there it is kind of in closer of the branch narrative. So here's Alex in his conversation with the prof for his accommodation for successful learning. And Alex has these statements, and then let's see what the user selects. And if the user selects this, then there's a series of options that unfold. If the user selects this one, there's another series if the user selects this one. Then we go on to the next conversation, and all of the programming then, the programmers then build the visual, like the virtual possibility from these scenarios. And obviously we were like, that's one of the reasons why a budget on a project is really important, because the bigger your budget, you could do lots of these. You could do scenarios ad nauseum if you had unlimited money for programming. But you also have to work within a budget and say, okay, what's a reasonable branched narrative? How many possible outcomes do we want to consider? How long is that programming going to take? Is it possible to program these outcomes, right? So this is where we would, the three of us plus Teresa would build these branched narratives, and then we would interact with our colleagues in Expert VR and say, okay, here's the narrative. What do you think? And then we would have several meetings where, our programmer, Julian, who really got into this project, I have to say, said, okay, I don't think I can do this, but maybe I can do this. And then we would have to go back and adjust the narration a little bit so that was something that Julian could work with more realistically. So the front stage stuff looks great, and it is great. but all the work happens back here. A lot of the work happens backstage, creating these scenarios, working things out, negotiating with the programmers, going back to the boards, keeping it possible for programming to happen, yet staying true to the situation so that we're accurately reflecting the disabled person's experience and not like sugarcoating it, right? So that's a little bit of a look at how big the thing can get and sort of a little close up at what goes on in the potential unfolding scenarios. I'm going to turn it back to Jamie.
I think, yeah, so I think Maureen, you're continuing with the first 2 points here, and then we have Jim, and then I'll come in at the end.
Yes, exactly, right. So I'm doing the first 2 points on this slide. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for that nudge. So the first 2 points here on our project milestones and our successes and challenges, the shift from simulation to scenario, which we've talked about a lot, but I really want to emphasize it, that if people want to work with disabled communities, individuals from disabled communities, disability communities, all of the research being done by disabled scholars is research moving us away from simulations. It's not an honorable way to interact with disabled people. And moving away from this simulation approach is really important. And moving into scenario approaches that are relational based. Beth Haller, who's a significant disability scholar, one of her claims is most non-disabled people learn about disability experience from popular culture and social media, and not from interactions with disabled people. And that's it's kind of bizarre when you think that, almost 25% of our population is experiencing disability. How are we avoiding conversations with that high of a percentage of our, of our population? But apparently we are. So interacting with disabled people is really important, and building scenarios around relationality and reciprocity and interdependence is really important. And then the piloting with disabled community members, we built this into our grant experience and our product development and we piloted the product with a group of disabled community members. My research center's advisory council is comprised of 12 members of the community who identify as disabled, and they tried the scenarios, and at that point, then we were able to refine them further around accessibility, because we had individuals with motor challenges who couldn't work with the remotes well, but who could work with the mouse, and we had individuals who couldn't keep the headset on because it was just too hard for their neck. So we had, so the two-dimensional engagement is really important for issues of access. But even the breakdown of explanation and the progressive engagement with a headset is important. So all of these things we were able to refine further by authentic consultation with disabled community members. And I would suggest, if you're going to move in this direction, you really need to be interacting with disabled people, because their suggestions and refinements make the experience more accessible and more realistic for everybody. Over to you, Jamie.
Actually, I'm next.
Okay.
And so we are, during our process, some of the actually successes that we had and challenges actually is that we had successive feedback. So the developers were kind enough to give us their milestone projects. So as we would work, we would determine, so in 2 weeks, we'll send an APK file. I would load it onto the headset, and then we would determine, those little changes that we needed. Maybe for some of it was the location of the text on the screen. and which actually brings us to the accessibility features. So they had some difficulty with the text-to-speech implementing it when you would mouse over the dialogue. And so early on, they didn't understand the necessity for it in our project. So we ended up working with them afterward, and the text-to-speech in it is actually recordings of text-to-speech. So when you mouse over it, it triggers the recording and plays it back. But I was really proud of Expert VR in their ability to navigate that even after it became a difficult situation. And I realized we're starting to run close on time, so I'll pass it on to Jamie.
For sure. Thanks, Jim. Implementing in the classroom has been probably the most exciting part, but also somewhat challenging and costly with a whole bunch of learning along the way. I think from finding the best solution to securely store the equipment, charge it, and then transporting it all the way to accessing various supports for implementation. I think we've come a long way at Niagara College in the past year that we've been implementing it into the classroom with students. I do think that hearing testimonials from students has been probably the most exciting part because they're thrilled to be using VR, not surprisingly, and they see its capacity for learning, and but also because they're really ready to engage with this content. I think the biggest challenge maybe that we've had so far is space. We currently don't have a dedicated lab for immersive tech in our area in academic and liberal studies. We do have some space that we're borrowing from a different program area, but that's not really sustainable long-term for us, considering the number of students we'd like to support. We do implement this into a class that's delivered into 35 programs across campus. So we reach anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 students per year. And currently we only have 15 headsets. So to reach those numbers is just without a dedicated lab space and more technology has been a bit of a hiccup. And then we also hired 2 students to help facilitation and implementation from the game development program at Niagara College, which has been a huge win, just alone with setup and takedown and providing one-on-one support for participants depending upon their level of experience and comfort with VR. But yeah, so we're in the process. We're learning. We're still lobbying for a dedicated space. And we're hoping that this grows from term to term. I think I'm continuing, Jim, if you can progress the slides. Amazing. Yeah, we're going to go through the supporting resources that were developed to help support implementation and facilitation. And I think the first thing we'll look at is the website. So we did create a website to house all of these supporting resources. There's a QR code in the bottom left of the screen there if you're here live and you're looking to, if you want to take a further look. In the website, we have a user guide for participants. We have a facilitator's guide for those who might be leading the session. We have an assessment tool that provides users an opportunity to reflect on their learning from the simulation. You can find additional resources on accessibility and universal design for learning, as well as more information about the project. I think we have a page that has media coverage and user testimonials. And then, of course, we've included the final report for the eCampus project for our external funders. We're currently working on a troubleshooting guide that we're going to add. And we're also going to add a few more user testimonials, video footage of user testimonials that we're working on editing right now. The next slide is looking more specifically at the assessment tool. which is organized, as I said, around the Ontario government's 5 identified barriers to accessibility, and ranging from attitudinal to organizational and systemic, architectural or physical, with information and communications or technology. And the tool itself, so next slide, please, Jim. The tool itself, we offer this both digitally and in hard copy for our users. And you'll see statements of understanding under each of the 5 barriers. And students are asked to rate themselves twice on each of those statements of understanding. So first, as they, where their knowledge was before the simulation, and then second, where their knowledge is after. This tool itself provides an opportunity, as I said, for students and users to reflect on their learning from the simulation, but we intentionally designed it as a post-pre survey. So we drew from Dr. Laney Konevsky's work at Simon Fraser University out of the Institute of Study of Teaching and Learning in the disciplines. And the survey itself is intended to evaluate the impact of the VR simulation and assess users' interpretation or perceptions of changes in their own knowledge, skills, attitudes, or future behaviors. But they do that in one form after the simulation. And that is to account for how users commonly inflate what they know or what they think their pre-knowledge is before they do something like this, because they don't know what they don't know until they do the simulation, and then they realize how much they learned and didn't actually know. So a post-pre-design survey is to kind of account for that sort of inflation of what you don't know what you don't know. And then it can more accurately gauge the measurement between the pre and the post if it's done afterwards. And then I know we're really, really close on time. So the last thing we're going to look at is user feedback. I don't think we've mentioned that we did a 3-phase pilot of the project, both with directors at our various divisions at Niagara College, and also with our Kappa Advisory Council at Brock University. And then we did a 3rd pilot phase with students. So we've collected some user feedback from not only the pilot stage, where that informed revisions of the simulation, but also through the various facilitation sessions that we've done over the past year. And users are thrilled to be using something this powerful. And you know, while there's another QR code here, sorry, that I can, it will take you to the user testimonials on our webpage too, where there's further videos. But all the feedback has been, a lot of the feedback has been really positive, and users are strongly impacted by it. You can see here a few quotes that I won't read, maybe I'll pick 1 or 2, but as a person with disabilities and as an educator, I'm so glad this project exists. Some of these things I never really even considered before doing the simulation. They think it's really cool to be trying something new. And then the last slide here is measuring the emotional engagement that users are having with the simulation, and trying to identify, you know, what kinds of emotions are coming up for them as they go through some of these simulations. And I've already mentioned how VR, you know, has the capacity to engage students affectively. So with the affect domain of learning, and we can see this here with the data that we've collected so far. So learners are empathetically and emotionally connecting to real life stories in the simulation, but in a safe space where they're not inflicting harm, and they're also not experiencing a level of discomfort that might come with engaging with internal biases live in real life. Right? Students can, I had somebody in our last session, we had some delegates from Jamaica come in for a project at Niagara College, and just this week we were able to deliver the simulation with them. And I had one of the participants say, I hesitated to pick one of the ableist options, the ableist response options, because I was like, oh, I don't want anyone to see that I'm doing that. But wait, I'm in VR, so nobody can see what's happening. I can go down that path and I can explore, some of those ableist assumptions that I may have internalized, or I may have myself. So students have reported, as you can see in the slide here, experiencing a range of emotions from hope and pride to anger, anxiety, and shame. And I think that's profound a learning when you can emotionally connect that way. And then the other reported responses included things like curiosity, nervousness, anticipation, and even shock. So while we're seated and we're in more of a conversational interaction, it doesn't necessarily harness the magnitude of what VR can do. But I think the impact of this conversational space is still really quite high when it comes to learning. I don't know, Jim and Maureen, if you have anything else to add to that before we finalize the sort of presentation part of this and go to questions.
Well, that sounds good. I think questions would be great. See what people want to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for the great speaker. So if you have any questions from the participants, you may want to use the chat, or you may come and jump on the board. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions. Yes, so before that, Evalina is saying, thank you so much for your wonderful and informative presentation, and also the very important work you are doing for EDI. So, okay. So the question is, first, maybe you can share, you showed a YouTube link and a YouTube video. Can you also share the link with our audiences? So that maybe Jim or Jamie, yeah, and then I am asking another questions in the meantime is, I think Jim was saying about the technology is helping the people with the vision impairments or blind. So the question is how virtual reality, which is a graphical tool, is helping people who is suffering from the vision impairment or blind. So this is the question.
Sure, yeah. So with our simulation we did create a flat screen version as well as a VR, so that people who maybe aren't able to use virtual reality due to some vision challenges can still experience the scenario. And within the VR, within the Seeing VR toolkit, there are tools for magnification. There are tools for different color backgrounds. So it's not a solution for people who are fully blind, but for people who are low vision, it can significantly increase the ease that they're able to view the things in it. When I tried it with the person who was fully blind, they suggested some even, add a descriptive track that you could just simply turn on or off. Instead of having to mouse over the response question or response options, maybe make it so you could thumb up and down and on the VR joystick to be able to do that. And then primarily using a VR headset for someone in that situation, perhaps the surround audio would make a difference, would add some level of interest for them. But there's actually entire groups of people who are blind that want to be able to use VR and experience that. If you're familiar with VR XR access. Last month, I think they had a person who was creating a tool for people who are blind in virtual reality, where in real life, if a blind person or a person who's blind has a cane, they can tap the floor and they can hear kind of an echo and determine the size of the room or the length of the room. And so someone is creating a tool where you can hit one of the VR buttons and it will make a click sound. They call it tapping their foot. And you'd be able to hear if a wall is close or if a wall is far. So there's lots of research on that right now.
Thanks for that. So there is one question from audiences: did you find sufficient academic literature on VR related to IDEA education, or is it a relatively small field? Who wants to pick?
Could you say that question again, Ahmed? Sorry.
Yes. So Evelina is saying, did you find sufficient academic literature on virtual reality related to IDEA education, or is it a small field still?
I can tell you at my institution, I'm at Brock University, we have a program called Digital Humanities. And in the digital humanities field, there are scholars who are specifically focusing on realistic engagement around marginalized communities, women, disabled people, etc. And there is significant scholarship on inclusive practices in VR instruction, social media, gaming, etc. So it's an increasing body of literature, but I would say it's a relatively new, in terms of academic terms, body of literature. So I think you'll see the beginnings of it in some of the social media work in accessible communication and representation work. And then that's gradually becoming more relevant for students in, say, degrees that combine, say, programming, gaming, and representational communication. And a lot of the programs that are attracting students with those interests are becoming more, well, necessarily more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So I would say it's increasing. I wouldn't say if you went in to look at gender in sociology, you wouldn't find the proliferation of material that you would find in accessibility in VR or accessibility in social media. But certainly there's a dedicated and interested group that's contributing to that area for sure. And I'm hoping we're going to see more contributions on the more technical sides that will count as legitimate scholarship as well.
Okay, so thanks for that. Because we are running out of the time, so maybe I can ask one more question. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Jamie, the YouTube link. And the question is, what's the next steps? Is it on ongoing projects, or is project that it's in the final, for example, steps, or what would be next steps for this project?
I mean, I would say, one of the things that Jamie mentioned earlier was more dedicated spaces on campuses where both students and staff and faculty members can engage in these kinds of realistic engagements, both for educative and professional development purposes, right? So I think dedicated spaces would be a great next step, just in terms of demonstrating how the usage would be helpful. Obviously, Jamie is funneling it through classes at Niagara with 15 headsets at a time. I have fewer headsets in my facility, and it's a similar kind of challenge, right? Is how do you get people involved when some of the material or some of the actual physical resources does have an expense associated with it. But I think that part's going to just be ongoing because academics and researchers and people who build collaborative teams like ours, we always know that money is going to be a problem with some things, right? But this is an open educational resource. And I think the more that we're able to engage with people on how they're using it and how successful it is, like that's a nice next step. But and Jim's comments about opening it up to a broader array of experiences from different disability communities. Like we didn't have anything in our scenarios on developmental disability communities or intellectually or communities where there's an intellectual diagnosis accompanying the person's experience. We didn't have any of those because those populations typically aren't represented in post-secondary, but those kinds of scenarios would be great to develop for community engagement or tourism or chambers of commerce or those kinds of communities that want to be authentically inclusive. Yeah, Jamie and Jim, I'll flip it back to you as well.
Okay, so
I was just,
yeah, please.
oh, no, sorry. I was just going to add next steps at the college, continuing with implementation. But we've also started staff and faculty training. So I think, not just using it in the classroom, but also using it to train and increase understanding in our various departments and divisions and services on campus. As well as the wider community. I know we've talked within our team of getting it out more into community and community agencies, as Maureen, you just mentioned. So those seem like logical next steps for me too.
Okay, so maybe I can ask another follow-up question, and then because we are recording this video and putting in the YouTube so that peoples later on also will watch. So the question is, I'm asking these questions to almost every speakers that we are inviting, is in terms of the sickness. So some people, when put the VR, they experience dizziness, right? So me is one of those persons.
Yes.
Have a VR, and Maureen, what I'm saying is,
I do.
how is your experiences?
So with our simulation, movement is one of the things that causes that issue, among many other things. But with our simulation, it's very stationary. You're sitting. There's very little actually movement of your body, and so we have found in our experiences that there is not a massive amount of people who have that challenge with the nausea. Just because we created a very static environment. If you put it on a roller coaster virtual simulation, most people will get sick because of the lack of movement where your brain thinks you're actually moving. And so for that reason as well, we created the flat screen version so people can still experience the education piece without the advantage of being immersed, but also without the disadvantage of feeling nauseous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can also progress, right? Like I have significant biometric vertigo. And so I was surprised at how little I was affected inside when I used the headset. Because if the barometric pressure changes, I feel like I'm sliding off the floor. So I can certainly relate to, the disorientation and the nausea, but also progressive engagement. Like if you're going to sit and go through all these 4 scenarios all at once, and that's probably not a good idea. It's good to be in there, just get used to the space, give yourself a couple of days, try it again. So like many experiences that have a motor or vestibular component, progression is a big part of it too, right? But the 2D version is super helpful. And I suspect like the headset tech is also going to improve so that you have more of a relationship with the technology that is closer to how your vestibular system reads head movement anyway, because it's really hard for your vestibular system to adapt to something that feels like it's moving when you're not moving, right? So your vestibular system, it is what it is. It can only react to the input, you know, that you give it. But progression really helps. And I suspect the technology will improve too.
Yeah, I've actually heard that Meta is working on a different kind of lens that can reduce that. Sometimes when I'm in particular games, and this isn't our simulation, but other kinds of games, just as a help, if you actually stand up and you cause your body to move in ways like that you're viewing, then it can help mitigate that nausea a little bit as well.
Yeah, it evens out the disconnect
Yeah.
that the vestibular system experiences. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to having you on the board and then sharing your experiences. Thank you very much.
No,
Our
thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you for the
Our
invitation.
pleasure, yeah.
Francesco, maybe you can give the final words.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was great. And thank you for the discussion following and answering all the questions and everything. So it was great having you all. Those super informative and super interesting to see what you're all doing with this project. So thank you as well to Ahmed for moderating the session and organizing the session. And thank you as well to everyone in the audience for taking the time to be here and participate and listen and learn with us. We do these series for all of you who join us and participate. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And then just very quickly, I just want to share my screen one last time. Just to remind everybody, this is a monthly speaker series. So we will be having another session in July, which will be coming up on the 26th. So with Dr. Daniel Hawes, who works at Carleton University and will be speaking on VR-based transformational learning experiences. So if that is of interest to you, again, that's on July 26th. If you're already registered, the reminders will go out as normal. But if you want to mark this on your calendar or share this with people in your networks that might be interested in this presentation who haven't registered yet, please do so, as the registration is always open and free for these sessions. And so with that, just one last big thanks for everybody for taking the time to be here today. We truly appreciate it. And yeah, it was a great session. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to a great team, Jim and Jamie, Teresa.